Amsterdam, 1602. A woman named Neeltgen Cornelis, a maid, earning less than 50 cents a day, walks into her employer's house. She's watched wealthy merchants come and go all month, signing their names in a leather-bound ledger, putting down thousands of guilders. She puts down 100, her life savings. And with that, she becomes one of 1,143 people to own a piece of the Dutch East India Company, the first publicly traded stock in history. A maid, owning a fraction of a fleet of ships she'd never board, sailing to islands she'd never see, carrying spices worth more than gold. That single idea, that ordinary people could own a piece of something enormous, built a system now worth over $69 trillion. And most people who use it every day have no idea how it works. Why does the stock market exist at all? A company needs money to grow. It can borrow that money, which means taking on debt and paying it back with interest, or it can sell pieces of itself. Those pieces are called shares. When you buy a share, you're not lending money, you're buying ownership, a tiny fractional slice of that company, its buildings, its products, its future profits, all of it. If the company does well, your slice becomes more valuable. If it doesn't, it shrinks. The Dutch figured this out first. Before the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, if you wanted to fund a shipping expedition to the East Indies, you bankrolled the whole thing yourself. If pirates sank your ship, you lost everything. The VOC flipped that model. Instead of one person taking all the risk, they let everyone share it. Their charter said, in plain language, all the residents of these lands may buy shares in this company. No minimum investment. Carpenters bought in. Farmers bought in. Neeltgen the maid bought in. In 1 month, they raised almost 6.5 million guilders from across 6 Dutch cities. But here's the problem they hadn't anticipated. Once 1,143 people own pieces of something, some of them are going to want to sell, and other people are going to want to buy. So an informal market sprang up on bridges and in courtyards around Amsterdam, people trading these ownership slips back and forth. That was the world's first stock exchange, and that investment worked. Dutch historian Lodewijk Petrum calculated that from 1602 through 1698, each 100 guilders invested in the VOC turned into about 65,000. Some years, shareholders received dividends worth 75% of their original investment. Occasionally, those dividends came in the form of actual spices, cloves and mace, shipped back from the East Indies. Profit is profit. Fast forward 190 years, 1792, New York City. The young United States had just survived its first financial panic, triggered by a speculator named William Dewar, who borrowed recklessly until he couldn't borrow anymore. Confidence in financial markets had collapsed, so 24 brokers and merchants gathered under a buttonwood tree, an American sycamore, at 68 Wall Street. They signed a 2-sentence agreement. They'd trade only with each other at set commission rates. That's it, 2 sentences. The goal was simple, to restore trust. That piece of paper became the New York Stock Exchange, and the fixed commissions it established lasted until 1975, when the SEC finally abolished them. That covers the history. The next question is mechanical. What happens when a company decides to sell shares to the public for the first time? It's called an IPO, an initial public offering. Think of it as the company's debut on a stage it can't leave. Before an IPO, the company is private. It might have a handful of investors, founders, maybe some venture capital firms. Going public changes everything. The company hires an investment bank, Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan, to act as an underwriter. The underwriter helps the company figure out what it's worth, sets a price per share, and files a registration statement with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the government body that regulates markets. Then the company goes on a roadshow, flying city to city, pitching itself to institutional investors, pension funds, hedge funds, mutual funds, trying to drum up demand before shares hit the open market. The whole process can take 6 months to over a year. And it's expensive. Legal fees, accounting, marketing, all of it. But once those shares start trading, the company has raised capital it doesn't have to pay back, unlike a loan. And it now has a public price, a number on a screen that the whole world can see, that rises and falls in real time. That's the primary market. Companies sell shares, buyers pay the company directly. After that first sale, you're in the secondary market, which is everything that happens after. Every time you buy a stock on your phone, you're in the secondary market. You're not buying from Apple or Tesla or whoever. You're buying from another person who decided to sell. Every stock has two prices at any given moment. The bid, which is the highest price a buyer is currently willing to pay, and the ask, which is the lowest price a seller is willing to accept. The difference between those two numbers is called the spread. If a stock has a bid of $50 and an ask of $50.05, the spread is 5 cents. For large, popular stocks like Apple or Microsoft, that spread can be as low as a penny. For smaller, less traded companies, it might be 20 or 30 cents. That gap is where market makers live. Market makers are firms that sit between buyers and sellers, constantly posting prices they're willing to buy and sell at. They keep the market liquid, meaning there's always someone on the other side of your trade. Without them, you might hit sell and wait hours for a buyer to show up. They earn the spread as compensation for taking that risk. Think of them as the dealers at a card table. They don't care who wins the hand. They make money by keeping the game running. So when you place a market order, you're saying, I'll pay whatever the current ask price is. Just get it done now. A limit order says, I'll only buy if the price drops to this specific number. And a stop order says, if this stock drops below this price, sell it automatically. Each one gives you a different level of control over what you pay or receive. Market orders are fast but imprecise. Limit orders are precise but might never get filled if the price doesn't reach your number. And the stock price itself? It's not some mysterious number generated by an algorithm in a dark room. It's just the last agreed upon price between a willing buyer and a willing seller. That's it. When more people want to buy than sell, buyers have to offer higher prices to get someone to part with their shares, and the price gets pushed up. When more people want to sell than buy, sellers have to accept lower prices, and it drops. The entire stock market is, underneath all the technology, an auction. Think of it like a farmer's market, except instead of tomatoes, people are bidding on tiny pieces of companies, and instead of one table, there are millions of auctions happening simultaneously, billions of times a day. So now you understand the plumbing. Shares are ownership slips. Exchanges are organized auction houses. Every price you see on a screen is just the last number two people agreed on. The question that matters next is, what makes that number move? Quick note, by the way, because it matters. Nothing in this video is telling you what to buy, sell, or hold. This is education, not financial advice. Your money, your decisions. A company's stock price is driven by forces that don't always agree with each other. Start with earnings. Every quarter, public companies report how much money they made. If a company earns more than people expected, the stock tends to go up. Less than expected, it drops. Not because the company changed overnight, but because people's expectations shifted. A company can report record profits and still watch its stock fall if those profits were even slightly below what analysts predicted. The market doesn't reward performance. It rewards performance relative to expectations. That's a crucial difference. Interest rates pull the strings from a different angle. When the Federal Reserve raises rates, borrowing gets more expensive for everyone. Companies, home buyers, students. Companies grow more slowly because expansion costs more. Investors can suddenly earn decent returns just parking money in bonds or savings accounts, things with almost no risk. So stocks become relatively less attractive and prices tend to fall. When rates drop, the opposite happens. Money floods into stocks because there's nowhere else to put it for a meaningful return. This tug of war between rates and stock prices is one of the most powerful forces in all of finance. Then there's the force most people underestimate: sentiment, fear and greed, stories and narratives. A CEO says something optimistic in an interview, and the stock jumps 3% before the company has sold a single additional product. A rumor about a product delay hits social media, and shares drop 5% before anyone's confirmed whether it's true. None of the company's fundamentals changed in either case, just the story people were telling themselves about its future. This is why you can have a company that's losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year, but whose stock keeps climbing. Investors aren't buying what the company is today. They're buying what they believe it'll become. And this is why you can also have a company that's solidly profitable, growing steadily, and its stock barely moves, because nobody's telling an exciting story about it. That gap between what a company is worth right now and what people are willing to pay for it is where most of the drama in the stock market lives. Now, when people say the market went up or the market crashed, they're usually talking about an index. An index is just a curated list of stocks designed to represent a slice of the broader market. The S&P 500 tracks 500 of the largest U.S. companies, weighted by their total market value. As of the end of 2025, the combined market cap of the S&P 500 alone was over $61 trillion. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is older and simpler, following just 30 blue-chip companies like Boeing, Coca-Cola, and Goldman Sachs. The NASDAQ Composite leans heavily toward technology, home to names like Apple, Nvidia, and Microsoft. None of them represent the entire market, but they're the thermometers people check to see if things are running hot or cold. A bull market means prices are generally rising and investor confidence is high. A bear market means they've fallen 20% or more from a recent peak. Both are normal, both are temporary, and both feel permanent while you're living through them. As of the start of 2026, the total value of the U.S. stock market stood at roughly $69 trillion. On the New York Stock Exchange alone, the average daily volume hit about 1.5 billion shares, valued at around $80 billion. On the NASDAQ, average daily volume topped 9 billion shares. Every trading day, between 9:30 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon Eastern Time, more money changes hands than most countries produce in a year. And increasingly, the majority of those trades aren't placed by humans at all. They're executed by algorithms, computers trading with other computers in fractions of a second, reacting to price movements faster than any person could blink. What was the first stock you ever bought? Or what's stopping you? Now look at the full picture. Stock prices aren't random. They're the result of real earnings, interest rate decisions, and millions of people making bets on the future simultaneously. Benjamin Graham, the investor who mentored Warren Buffett, put it as clearly as anyone ever has. In the short run, the market is a voting machine. In the long run, it's a weighing machine. Meaning, day to day, stocks move on popularity, emotion, and headlines. Year over year, decade over decade, they move on whether companies make money. But here's what the mechanics don't tell you. Who's actually in this system, and who's watching from the outside? Roughly 62% of American adults own stock in some form, whether that's individual shares, mutual funds, or something inside a retirement account like a 401k. That sounds like a healthy majority. Look closer and the picture cracks open. Among households earning $100,000 or more, 87% own stock. Among those earning under $50,000, 28%. College graduates, 84%. People with only a high school diploma, 42%. White adults, 70%. Hispanic adults, 38%. The market is technically open to everyone. Participation tells a different story. And ownership doesn't mean equal ownership, not even close. The top 10% of American households hold 93% of all stock market wealth. The richest 1% alone own 54%, up from 40% just 2 decades ago in 2002. So when the news announces the market climbed 10% this year, that gain isn't evenly distributed across the country. The vast majority of that wealth increase flows to people who are already wealthy. For most Americans, their biggest financial asset isn't a stock portfolio. It's their home. There's a behavioral dimension too, one that affects everyone who participates, regardless of income. Studies consistently show that individual investors sell when markets drop out of fear, locking in losses at the worst moment, and pour money in when markets peak out of excitement, paying the highest prices. The average investor underperforms the very index funds they invest in, not because the fund picked bad stocks, but because the person bought and sold at the worst possible times. The research firm Dalbar has tracked this for decades. The gap between what the market returns and what the average investor earns is almost entirely explained by human emotion. Panic selling in downturns, euphoria buying at peaks. And then there are the people who never start at all. Not always because they can't afford to, though many genuinely can't, but because the whole system feels opaque, risky, and built for someone else. The vocabulary alone is a wall. Bid, ask, spread, PE ratio, market cap, yield curve, earnings per share, price to book. Every term feels like a password to a club you weren't invited to. The market isn't a members-only institution, but it sure presents itself like one. The stock market isn't a casino, but it can feel like one if you don't understand what you're holding. There's a real difference between owning a company and betting on a price. When you buy a share of a company because you believe in its products, its leadership, and its ability to generate earnings over the next decade, that's ownership. When you buy because the chart went up yesterday and you think it'll go up tomorrow, that's speculation. Both happen on the same exchange. Both use the same technology, but they're completely different activities. One pattern worth noticing: every major market crash in history, 1929, 1987, 2000, 2008, the market eventually recovered. The S&P 500 has returned an average of roughly 10% per year over the long term. But, and this is the part people skip, not every individual company recovered. Enron went to zero. Lehman Brothers went to zero. Thousands of dot-com companies went to zero. The market always comes back is true for the market as a whole. It's not true for every stock inside it. That distinction matters more than almost anything else a new investor can learn. When you're looking at a stock, the question isn't, is this going up? The question is, what am I actually buying? You're buying a fraction of a business. That business either makes money or it doesn't. It either has a plan for the next 10 years or it's coasting on hype. If the only reason anyone can give you for why something is a good investment is because it keeps going up, you're not at the beginning of a trend. You're probably near the end of one. The stock market is a tool. It lets companies raise money to build things, and it lets ordinary people participate in that growth. That's the promise. The gap between the promise and the reality is filled with jargon, gatekeeping, and a financial industry that sometimes profits from your confusion. Understanding the machinery doesn't guarantee returns, but it strips away the mystery that keeps people either frozen on the sidelines or gambling without knowing it. 423 years ago, a maid in Amsterdam put down everything she had on an idea: that she could own a piece of the future. The ships were bigger than anything she'd ever seen. The oceans were dangerous. She had no spreadsheet, no brokerage app, no YouTube video explaining what she was doing. She just understood the concept. Put money in, share the risk, share the reward. The tools looked nothing like what she used. Screens replaced ledgers, algorithms replaced handshakes, and a trade that took her a full afternoon now takes a fraction of a second. The concept hasn't moved an inch. If this made something click, subscribe.